Hey there, folks. I'm AniPhil, resident AniPhil, here to give you your fix of anime philosophy. Here we are again, talking about My Hero. So I watched the new episode already, but I wanted to take a different angle. I didn't want to really focus on the whole episode. I more so wanted to talk about the focus that they had, where they kind of did a documentary on Tomura Shigaraki. So I'm just going to put an image up so you guys can see. Some special feature. Who was Tomura Shigaraki? So pretty much as they go through the episode, it's like different citizens reacting to the impact that Shigaraki had, how people initially thought of him in terms of like when he first appeared on the scene, like he was just some punk, act like a toddler, wasn't organized, wasn't strong enough to do anything substantial, right? And now we're looking at the aftermath of the final arc, and obviously, that was wrong. And Tenko Tomura Shigaraki, he did a lot of damage. He leveled a large deal with Japan, right? So pretty much just focusing on what he meant. So I'm gonna keep pausing it just because I don't want to get a copyright strike, but just gonna have the conversation about who Tomura was, why he existed, and why he was in some ways kind of necessary, just because of how in the world of My Hero, hero society at large looked at people, right? How they treated people, how they kind of created a lot of these villains because of their unfair treatment of a lot of these people, Shigaraki included. So we have this one guy, right? He's saying he's so glad that he was defeated because he was terrifying. Obviously, you would be terrified if you saw a superpowered Shigaraki who could decay things by just touching, like, and do an AoE decaying of things, even you, right? And then thank God he didn't have access to his other powers, right? But it was like, you just see him, just destroying and leveling city blocks and skyscrapers and things of that nature. You're just like, what is going on, right? So it's fairly normal, at this point in the story. Shigaraki was known to be feared and looked at as a terror. So, makes sense that the everyday citizen feared him. So here we have someone else giving their perspective on Shigaraki. The first person that we met, he pretty much just talked about how scary Shigaraki was, which is like we can relate to, because if we saw Shigaraki, we probably would try to run to the nearest place we can, shelter, whatever, even though that probably wouldn't matter. So then we have these two girls just talking about his impact on their lives, how he's a killer and destroyed her house and pretty much ruined her and her friends' lives. And this pretty much just talking about him as a terrible person. This is the perspective I was referencing earlier, how they just kind of saw him as like common scum, common thug, not really much to worry about, right, in terms of the grand scheme of things. But now you're kind of, second guessing that, right? And now they're like, oh, man, he really became something, right, that was a force to be working with for bad. And obviously they hated it because it messed up their lives, right? But I just want to more so focus on the later bit of what he said. So we're just going to focus on the later bit of what this particular gentleman says about Shigaraki, because I found it kind of interesting and telling of the society as a whole in terms of their perspective, and kind of, like I said, what created a Shigaraki, what led to the impetus of a League of Villains, and for the organization of said villainry that we've seen within the My Hero verse, within the world of MHA. So here we have Doria telling Spinner about Shigaraki's last words, right? And how he specifically wanted to address it to Spinner and not Dabi and Toga or Mr. Compress or anybody else, even though they're all like dead now. But how this was a specific message for Spinner, right? And how he wanted to let him know that I fought to destroy to the very end, right? That I maintained my integrity in terms of what I said I was going to do and who I was going to be and what I was going to stand for. I'm gonna play a little bit of it, but essentially what we see in Spinner's reaction is a very emotional reaction, because him and Shigaraki had very close bond, right? Spinner was a bit of a shut-in. Tomura was outcast as well. You could pretty much see the whole League of Villains kind of in that same vein, right? And so they found camaraderie in the fact that they played the same video games. They shared a lot of the same feelings and experiences because of how society shunned them and ostracized them, right? It made them feel othered. So let me play this. So again, right, Shigaraki was Spinner's hero, right? Shigaraki was Spinner's hope. He represented a tearing down of current society. He represented a revolution of how things are, right? No more of the All Might type society where it's just like heroism, and if you got a bad quirk, quote unquote bad quirk, right? Or you're anamorph and you look villainous, right? You get treated a certain way, right? He wanted all those things to go away. That's why Stain was such a popular figure, right? Because it was an understanding within the villains, at least, right? Even if it wasn't understood within the larger society, it was understood within the villains that a lot of the heroes that were called heroes, right, weren't actually heroes, right? They wanted to be celebrities, they wanted money, they wanted fame, they wanted popularity, but they weren't really doing like work in terms of making society better, right? So it was like, we can understand the hero villain dynamic in a traditional generic sense, right? But when you have public health issues, you have public crises, right? Or things that are happening within the local community, right, that are causing more people to become villains, right? That needs to be addressed. It should not be swept under the rug. It should not be looked at as one of those things where it's like, oh, they were always going to be a bad person. No, right? The reason why this person largely went down this path is because they were not given certain supports, right? Because certain things were not afforded to them, right? Or certain things were taken away from them, or they were treated a certain way, or certain tragic happened to them, or a lot of tragic things happened to them, right? In quick succession. So now they end up in a place where they don't know how to process their trauma. So they resort to the only thing that makes sense to them, right? Using their powers. And when you're shunned and you looked at like you're trash, you start to internalize those things. And so you might start doing trashy things. And I know this is an oversimplification, right? But it's like part of these things, part of these aspects that I'm like listing off and talking about are some of the things that motivated a lot of these villains to begin villainy or even be like sensitive enough to go down that path, right? To be conditioned or open to the possibility of doing bad things. They were hurt, they were isolated, they were vulnerable, right? All for one played on that. And then you have a whole bunch of other people that kind of fell within, they fell within that category. And unfortunately, society really didn't have a place for them, which is kind of interesting, as a real life parallel. If you think about like, people go to prison or been to prison and stuff like that. It's like society doesn't necessarily do a good job of readjusting those people, but that's a different conversation for a different time. But when we talk about villains, people who had certain quirks, right, that were more dangerous or more destructive, society didn't know what to do with them. So they displaced them. They shunned them. They relegated them to the annals of society, right? They treated them like they were dirt. They treated them like they didn't exist. They treated them like they were bad from their inception. So what do people do when they are treated as if they're bad from their inception? Usually they go down a bad path, And Shigaraki, like I said in last video, even though a large portion of what happened to him was manufactured and created and orchestrated by All For One, there also was some things that happened after, the situation with his family, right? He walked through society, right? Looking dismayed, looking scared and stuff like that. But people didn't look at it like that. So they ignored him. They looked at him just like he was disgusting, looked at him like he, again, was a terror. And so he ended up going deeper and deeper into the darkness. And when you're raised in that type of darkness, that type of anger, that type of resentment, it's going to build and keep building and keep building and keep building until it reaches this critical mass, which was this final arc. I've been yapping for a while, but essentially, y'all get what I'm saying. And the bad thing about it is a lot of people in society still didn't learn. A lot of people in the MHA society still did not learn. Yeah, I'm just going to let you guys see what I'm talking about.
好きだったんだよ。警察の調査が進み、悲惨な過去も明るみになってき、引きこもってる。ずっと俺ゲーム。原因究明は重要です。センチメンタルに取り沙汰せば繰り返します。そしたらあいつもやってるゲームは。我々は毅然とした態度で畜生である。初めてできた。So there it is, right? So you have the juxtaposition of Spinner saying how Toma was his hero. He stood up for all the things that Spinner felt like he was not getting in society, for all the things that Spinner represented as a person, right? Talking about him being a shut-in, talking about him playing video games and stuff like that. You might as well say like, Tora was kind of like the leader of the incel community, say the other, but it's kind of like how it feels, right? He was a leader to a lot of people who pretty much for whatever reason, or he was the leader of a lot of people for whatever reason were put in a position where they were not seen, accepted, embraced by the larger community. You could talk about Nietzsche, you could talk about incels, you could talk about animorphs, you could talk about people who had dangerous quirks, you could talk about people who just looked weird, right? Think about Toga and how she smiled and stuff. Like, you just think about all these people who are othered, right? Tomura was their hero. Thinking back to the battle, when we even saw that one guy who was just looking at his laptop and said, destroy it, Tomura, destroy it, right? He was talking about destroying everything in society because, as the old proverb goes, and I'm going to paraphrase it, the one who is not embraced by the village will burn it down just to feel its warmth, right? So essentially, Tomura represented all of these outcasts. And then to go to the other side, the framing of these journalists and people who are writing about the situation and kind of trying to decide how they're going to tell the story, how they're going to frame the narrative. You have people who are saying that essentially they're going to frame the narrative in a way where it's like, he was a piece of trash. Let's just call him a piece of trash, call him out, hold him accountable, right? And then on the other end, they're talking also about, the things that came out about
his childhood, his upbringing, the things that led him to become what he became, right? And I feel like the way that the discourse is being had is really not necessarily reflective of understanding how he got there, right? And that's not to say that you can't call a spade and say that what he did was horrible, terrible, and that he ultimately became a terrible person, right? But you also have to recognize the conditions, right, that created that terror, right? That created that monster, that created that being of destruction. And that's not to say that there are not good parts about destroying things, right? In the sense that it's like the hero society as it was needed to be deconstructed, right? Because it could not sustain itself. It could not sustain itself off of the image that was the symbol that was All Might, right? But beyond that, it could not sustain itself on the undercurrents of the fact that a lot of these heroes did not represent the heroism that All Might represented, right? They did not represent self-sacrifice for the good of the Commonwealth, for the benefit of the Commonwealth. They did not represent bravery and courage and going the extra mile, right? Literally to the point of breaking bones and putting yourself in grievous situations and danger and stuff like that. A lot of these heroes, you know, they just did it for the fame and the fortune, unfortunately. And that's why Stain was a figure that he was, right? That's why Tomura was the person who he was, right? That's why Redestro, right? You talk about all these different movements, right? All these different organizations. Think about the reason why the undercurrent existed so strongly is because there were all these people who were not accounted for by the society. Fortunately, Midoriya, his friends, they have an understanding of this, right? They have an understanding of what created these people, right? So they are working to create a type of heroism that includes social health, right? That includes looking out for the betterment of all people, right? And not necessarily just thinking about heroism in a linear sense where, you know, people are just looked at as good and bad and these binaries and labels are put on them readily without trying to actually help them, right, through the things that they're going through or might experience if the hand is not extended to them. And I'm off my soapbox. I've been talking for a while.
はい、俺が死柄木弔を
コミックだといいな。
あ
心配しなくていいよ。一生忘れない。
これからも伝言だ。
So yeah, as we could see, honestly, it was a really good arc. I didn't really have anything else to really talk about. I just wanted to talk about the narrative, the conversation, the documentary of Shigaraki, and kind of like the framing of it. What did you guys think though? Like, how would you describe Shigaraki, right? Would you talk about him in the sense of, you know, just being a tragic story? Would you talk about him being a spokesperson for the unheard? And that's kind of a large part of what his destruction represented. Like, what would you say about Shigaraki? How did you guys view him, right? Beyond him just being a villain. But yeah, drop that in the comments, like, comment, subscribe for more MHA content. Also, guys, if you have any content that you want me to react, respond to, do an analysis, breakdown on, just let me know. Until next time, that has been your Phil File. Peace.